Hello, and welcome to the Once Again podcast. We are your hosts, Ashley and Jason. In this episode, we'll be looking at the 1847 Charlotte Brontë novel, Jane Eyre. This is a special bonus episode for Ashley's birthday, so once you get done listening, if you'd like to reach out to us on our social media accounts and wish Ashley a happy birthday, we'd appreciate it. Also, we will be discussing what some may consider spoilers in this podcast episode, so if you don't want to know anything about this 176-year-old novel, tune out now. With all that out of the way, get your live-in nurse drunk, steal the key to the attic lock, set your husband's bed on fire, and enjoy this episode.
Hi, do kids, hi, do wife, hi, do kids, hi, do wife.
Bertha's on the run. Jane Eyre, originally published as Jane Eyre, an Autobiography, is a novel by the English writer Charlotte Brontë. It was published under her pen name Currer Bell on October 19th, 1847 by Smith, Elder and Company of London. The first American edition was published the following year by Harper and Brothers of New York. Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age story, for those who aren't into fancy terminology.
Who aren't English majors.
yeah. Which follows the experiences of, which I assume, I'm not really going to use the summary too much in discussing it, but I assume that the summary was written by a British English authoritarian, authority, like some sort of professor or something, because not only is the summary very well written, but they use all the excessive O's in words and U's that English, like they spelled honor with a U and flavor and like all like different, they use excessive letters that the Americans don't use. So I was like, oh, this was written by a British person and quite well written. But anyway, as I was saying, Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age story, which follows the experiences of its eponymous heroine, including her growth to adulthood and her love for Mr. Rochester, the brooding master of Thornfield Hall. The novel revolutionized prose fiction by being the first to focus on its protagonist's moral and spiritual development through an intimate first-person narrative where actions and events are colored, see right there you have the colored with excessive letters, by a psychological intensity. Brontë has been called the first historian of the private consciousness and the literary ancestor of writers like Marcel Proust and James Joyce, which is why I think you enjoy James Joyce so much as you do. And
I don't think I've read anything by James Joyce. Fun fact.
Oh, I was thinking of, yeah, you're right. I was thinking of, what's his name from The Great Gatsby? Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald, yes.
Yeah. But the book contains elements of social criticism with a strong sense of Christian morality at its core, and is considered by many to be ahead of its time because of Jane's idealistic character and how the novel approaches the topics of class, sexuality, religion, and feminism. Along with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, it is one of the most famous romance novels. So I'm going to give a little bit about Charlotte Bronte's background now, and then we'll dive into the plot. Charlotte Brontë was an English novelist and poet, and the eldest of the three Brontë sisters who survived into adulthood and whose novels became classics of English literature. Brontë was born April 21st, 1816, in Thornton, Yorkshire, England. She enlisted in school at Roe Head in January 1831 at age 14. She left the year after to teach her sisters Emily and Anne at home, returning in 1835 as a governess. In 1839, she undertook the role of governess for the Sedgwick family, but left after a few months to return to Haworth, where the sisters opened a school but failed to attract pupils. Instead, they turned to writing, and they were each first published in 1864 under the pseudonyms of Currer, Ellis, and Action Bell. Although her first novel, The Professor, was rejected by publishers, her second novel, Jane Eyre, was published in 1847. The sisters admitted to their Bell pseudonyms in 1848, and the following year were celebrated in London literary circles. Charlotte Brontë was the last to die of all her siblings. She became pregnant shortly after her marriage in 1854 but died on March 31st, 1855, at age 38, almost certainly from a complication of pregnancy, which causes excessive nausea and vomiting. Brontë was laid to rest in St. Michael's and All Angels Church in Haworth, England. Okay, so that's all I have about that. I have a little bit of a plot summary here. I guess, do you want me to read that too? Or?
No, we'll just probably, pick at it as we need.
Okay.
Though I figure we should... The reason we're discussing Jane Eyre in particular is... Jason is reading it for class this coming semester.
Yeah, and it's one of your all-time favorites.
It's one of those things that I know very well.
Yeah. You have a quote from it on your class ring?
I do.
Yeah.
It was on my graduation cap too.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dr. Helen Davis, who is my advisor, and I love her. And it's her class you're taking, which is why you're reading this.
Yeah.
So I'm sure she will give this a listen, so shout out to her.
Yeah, shout out to you, Dr. Davis.
You're already gonna love half the things he's been saying. He was telling me in the car earlier, and I was like, oh, you're perfect.
Yeah.
She's gonna love that.
Well, let's dive into discussing it then.
Okay.
So I just want to start off with my first criticism, because I only have two criticisms of it, really. My first criticism is that the first 10 chapters of the novel are boring as hell. And they could be summarized in 2 sentences. I was an orphan who was abused by my aunt and cousins. Then I went to school where my best friend died, and I was abused early on there, and eventually became a teacher, and the school reformed and everything. So maybe 3 sentences if you really want to stretch it. But the first 10 chapters are really tedious to get through. I generally don't enjoy... I enjoy the classics like this and Frankenstein and other, classic literature, the story of them, but the language sometimes is very erudite and hard to get. As soon as I read about a character who dines in the conservatory, and I'm like, oh, screw you. I'm like, that's not, no one lives that way anymore. But the story is very good in here, but the first 10 chapters are just grueling to get through because I find them so boring. They do lay down a good foundation for the rest of it, but for me, the real plot kicks in once Jane leaves school. She becomes a teacher and everything, and she's there, but once she leaves, that's when the plot really kicks off for me. I don't know how you feel about it, if you want to discuss. I did mention to you when I was... Because I listened to it on Audible.
Yeah.
And I did mention to you how I never knew where the Red Room trope came from before. But I obviously had heard of it before, and I knew that it was, a veiled attempt at a woman, coming into her menstruational cycle and everything like that. But I'm also way more familiar with the Red Room trope because of Marvel Comics and their character of Black Widow, because the Red Room is where she was trained in. There, the red having a double meaning the Soviets But I knew about the Red Room trope before, but I never knew it came from Jane Eyre because I'd never read Jane Eyre before.
Yeah.
And that's my first major criticism, is that the first 10 chapters are really grueling to get through, but once you get to chapter 11 onward, it just gets interesting and stays more interesting.
See, I think those first chapters, though, are, to set up her as a narrator. And I know you already said earlier that in the car with me that you were like, I don't know if I trust her as a reliable narrator.
Yeah.
And we're unsure if that was, a thing at the time. I don't know. I don't think it doesn't need to be a thing, but I know narrative theory, Dr. Davis, I know you're listening to this, narrative theory is very much... It applies to a lot of what's going on here.
Yeah, because Jane is a victim for the most part throughout the entire novel, not just the first 10 chapters, but also she never does anything wrong, and if she does does something wrong, it's justified because of how she was feeling emotionally at the time and stuff. And there's other characters in it that I'm like, what is going on with this character? You're not painting this character in a good light. Even Mr. Rochester, I'll just say it. You were supposed to like Mr. Rochester. I do not like him at all. I think he is the epitome of toxic masculinity.
I don't think you're supposed to like him. He does end up being, the love interest and does marry her, but I don't really think I don't think you're supposed to like him. Yeah. I think you're still supposed to like her more and just be like, well, she has her independence at the end, which is really all she wanted, and she has the man too. More so, you're supposed to be like, well, she got everything, but I don't know if you're supposed to like him.
Okay.
But I also think, again, I think a lot of the, early stuff going on in the early chapters is, a lot of, weird, spiritual, spooky, gothic stuff is going on, too, in those early chapters that also, I think, lend its hand narratively to, is it you know, is she just embellishing a lot of what's going on? Because she's embellishing, it seems like she's embellishing a lot there.
There's a lot of setup for the supernatural throughout this novel, but every setup for it, except for the very last thing that happens that I'll say is supernatural, is explained. Like, there's a rational explanation for all of it. Jane is terrified of the red room, not just because it's this horrible room with no windows and everything's painted red, but it's because it's the room that her uncle died in.
Yes.
And she thinks his ghost is still in there, and she sees the ghost and passes out and everything. But, you know, that's a child. It's easily explained that, you know, she imagined him there, her anxiety got to her, and she eventually passed out from it. I don't know. Should I move on forward, or do you want to discuss the earlier parts more?
No, we can keep moving.
Okay, so next she goes to Lowood, where she meets a friend, Helen, and Helen is very bright and very kind to Jane. And
also very religious, very pious.
Yes, extremely pious, actually, you're right.
Which is why she's one of, like, you know,
don't worry about the bad things that happen to you, because you'll be rewarded.
She's very much a point of, like, helping Jane, like, understand that, like, she needs to be a good person, and forgiveness is a good thing. Like, she learns that through Helen.
Yeah.
And then Helen dies.
And suffering is part of the path that you have to go on and everything. Yeah, and then Helen dies of consumption or tuberculosis, whatever you want to say. And Jane also gets a role model in, I can't think of her name now. The teacher at Miss Low at Lowood. Not Mr.
Miss
Brown.
Temple.
Miss Temple, yeah. Miss Temple is her role model, essentially, and she's the head of the school. Well, she's, I guess we would say, the principal here. Like, she kind of, or a teacher or whatever.
Good name for it.
Yeah, and she takes care of the girls and looks after them. Mr. Brocklehurst is actually in charge of the school, and he's awful, not only to Jane, but to everyone. In fact, the one day, because they had such a poor porridge in the morning, Miss Temple makes sure that they have a luxury of bread and cheese to eat. Like, oh my gosh, what a luxury. And then Mr. Brocklehurst shows up and he's like, bread and cheese? What are you letting them eat bread and cheese for? Like, no. Like, and a lot of the girls at the school end up getting sick and dying, and then there's an investigation, and it's found out, you know, things at the school need to change, and they do. And they
also, the reason Brocklehurst doesn't like Jane is strictly because her aunt was like told him, like, she's a terrible liar, whatever. Which when Jane, by the way, perfect girl, leaves her aunt's household and is like, you were never good to me anyway. You treated me like dirt.
Yeah.
Bye. Like,
F you. Yeah.
You think you're religious and pious and a good person? Well, you're not.
Yeah.
Screw you, lady. And like, man,
Mrs.
I wish I had the balls to say that to somebody. Like,
Mrs. Reed, and this is also Jane at 10 years old.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like she's an adult and everything. Like, she's well aware of how abusive her aunt is and everything.
Which is also one of those things, like, did she actually say that? Like, you know, narratively? Like, can we trust that, like, little 10-year-old actually said that? Because I don't know if I'd have... Like, I might say that to somebody now, but I'm freaking 31, gonna be 32 when this is out. But, like...
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that at age 10.
And at this point in the story, I expected... This is going to sound silly to say, but I expected Eyre to be a pun, and I expected the Reed's money to actually be Jane's money, and that she was going to be the Eyre, H-E-I-R. Like I thought Eyre was a pun last name or whatever, and that she was going to be the heir to the... That doesn't exactly work out that way.
It doesn't work out that way necessarily.
Yeah. Well, I said to you in the prediction, I said, I think I was only in like the first 10 chapters or so, but I was like, okay, so she's going to meet someone who she falls in love with, who doesn't really love her, which I would argue still happens. But then he's going to be a rich man, but then it's going to turn out he's actually not rich, but it's going to be okay because the Reed's money is actually her money. She's the heir. It kind of works out. It's different details, but it kind of works out that same way. I'll give myself about 60% credit just on that guess. But yes, so
you almost had it.
She eventually becomes a teacher at Lowood, and it's reformed and it gets better for the girls and everything. And then one day Jane's like, this is really boring. Like, I'm bored at my job. I want to go do something else. I'd like to...
Well, Miss Temple leaves, Helen dies. You know, she doesn't have anything at that point keeping her there.
That's true. And she advertises to be a governess. And she gets a response, and which I did think was clever that she said respond to J.E. in the paper, Like, it was like she kind of had to hide from the school that she was going to leave. So she was like, she didn't want her full name advertised in there and everything. But that's a small detail, but I just liked it. I was like, oh, Jane, you're a little clever. Like, I was like, you don't want to cause any problems at the school if you don't have to. But she leaves to become a governess at Thornfield Hall for a little French girl named Adele. And there she meets a lot of different characters, but most importantly is Mr. Rochester, who's the master, I guess you would say, of Thornfield Hall. And she meets him actually in the woods.
Yeah.
He's fallen off of his horse. She doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know who she is. And she helps him. And essentially, and then at a certain point, it's kind of revealed that they both fell in love with each other, love at first sight, kind of. And she even remarks, like, he's ugly, but I can't get over how much I love him. Like he's an ugly man, but there's just something about him. Like, and I said to you that this
beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
With the exception of actual romance novels or romance smut, whatever you want to call them, adult novels that I've read, this is the horniest book I've ever read in my entire life. Jane and Mr. Rochester are so horny for each other the entire time. Their conversations are just layered with innuendo and like how much they want to be drawn to each other and everything. It is by far the horniest book I've ever read in my life, especially for 1847. I couldn't imagine
and this is why she couldn't publish under her name to start out with. It had to be a man's name.
Yeah,
scandalous for a woman to be writing such smut.
Agreed. But it's a super. That's what I mean. Once you get past those first 10 chapters, it picks up and it gets so interesting, and it's like, oh, this is great. But Jane, comes to care for Adele. Like she basically becomes an adoptive mother to her.
Mother.
And make sure that Adele's well taken care of and everything. And it gets revealed by Mr. Rochester that Adele might be his biological daughter. We both think that he's not actually the biological father. Mr. Rochester was messing around with a French stage girl, and he came to find out that he wasn't the only man in her life. And because Mr. Rochester goes to, which I assumed when they meant the continent, they meant North America, but they're actually referring to the continent as Europe, the rest of Europe. But Mr. Rochester goes to the rest of Europe a lot of the time. He doesn't spend much time at home at all. He's always out and about and doing business dealings. Yeah. And eventually Adele's mother gets sick and leaves Adele to Mr. Rochester because she says he's his biological father. Which, if I was a French stage actress who was messing around with a bunch of different men, I would also choose the rich man to be the father of my child. I'd be like, I need her to be looked after.
That is the choice.
Yeah, it's the rich guy. I forget exactly when this gets revealed, but we also come... Well, should I say strange things start happening at Thornfield Hall?
Strange things. Again, more mystical type stuff.
Yeah. Mr. Rochester's bed gets set on fire, which Jane rescues him from. Mm-hmm. She hears mysterious laughter coming all the time, which she attributes to this woman, Grace, who's at the house, who Jane doesn't know what Grace does.
But she's there.
Yeah, and she thinks that Grace started the fire, but Mr. Rochester doesn't fire her or get rid of her, and she's like, this is peculiar, what's going on with Grace? And Rochester's like, one day I'll tell you about what's going on with Grace, but not today. And then Mr. Rochester has all these other rich English people show up, and he is very clearly interested in this one beautiful English woman.
Well, we did skip something.
I'm sorry.
Jane's aunt is dying.
I think that does come before.
It does come before. It does come before because Jane's gone for a bit.
Yeah, Jane's aunt, Mrs. Reed, is dying and asks to see her. Like, she wants to see Jane.
And Jane, being the forgiving, beautiful person that she is, actually goes.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And
doesn't not be me.
Doesn't just go, but also takes care of her dying aunt.
Yes.
Whereas her cousin John, who was the worst of the children to her, has killed himself because essentially he squandered the family fortune.
Yep.
Her other two cousins, I'm trying to remember their names now. This is what happens when I listen to a book rather than read it. I can't remember all the characters' names. But
should be.
Georgiana is the pretty one, who's still pretty but has gotten fat, if I remember correctly. And what's the other one's name? Anne? hold on. I have a list of the characters here.
Eliza,
yeah. Eliza is the smart one, and has kind of set herself up. She's going to move to America, as a matter of fact, after all this, and become a nun, I believe. She said she's going to become a Catholic nun. And Georgiana will be taken care of, because even though she's gotten fat, she's still pretty, so someone will marry her eventually. Yeah. But they're not interested in taking care of their own mother. They're just like, oh, she's dying. Oh, how droll. But Jane takes care of her and nurses her until she dies. And it's revealed by her aunt before she dies, who's... I think she had a stroke, and she's suffering the symptoms of a stroke, so she's not really cognizant of what's going on all the time. But she reveals that Jane has a surviving uncle.
Who wanted to take her.
Yeah, who wanted to take Jane.
And the aunt, being a terrible human being, told him that Jane was dead.
Yeah, she died at Lilwood when all those other kids died.
What a douche.
Yeah. So, Jane goes back to Thornfield Hall, and Mr. Rochester at that time period has brought on these other English people into the house, one of whom he's interested in, the other one...
Blanche Ingram.
Thank you, Blanche Ingram, yes. And Jane's like, oh, they're gonna get married, and I'm super jealous because I'm really horny for Mr. Rochester. And one night, I'm just gonna skip, there's a gypsy woman, a tarot card reader, who's there, who's going to give everyone their fortune. And Jane goes last, because Jane doesn't think that the fortune card teller is gonna see her or whatever. But the fortune teller's like, oh no, there's one more woman who I have to see, send her in here. And Jane almost immediately sees through the disguise that it's actually Mr. Rochester dressed up as this fortune teller woman. And he's like, oh yes, I did this to test everyone and see what their real interests were in me and blah, blah, blah. Like, he's a master manipulator and extremely excessive that he went through this ridiculous disguise and everything.
I mean, kudos at the same time. Also... The fact that no one else recognized him right away, y'all are terrible friends.
I think that has a degree of the sexism in it, because he only sees the women, he won't see any of the men. So I think it's a slight degree of sexism to be like, oh no, of course a man would recognize him right away, but these women aren't going to. You know, I feel anyway.
But who's to say that they didn't recognize him, just didn't say anything, and we're like, wow, Rochester's being a freaking weirdo.
That's we're talking about how we're not sure if Jane's supposed to be a reliable narrator.
Jane's saying, like, oh, no one knew it was him. Like,
yeah.
For all you know, she left that room to go get her fortune, and they were like, I don't see that was Mr. Rochester.
What the hell is up with this guy?
What do you think he's up to?
Yeah,
what a weirdo.
Let's get out of here.
Blanche, you sure you want to marry this guy?
Yeah.
He seems a little odd.
But that's essentially what happens, is that Rochester is like, no, Jane, I don't want to marry Blanche. I want to marry you. You're so perfect and smart, and you're the woman that I want, and I want to be with, and I've longed for you since the first day we met, and I'm super horny for you, and you're super horny for me, so let's get married. And Jane's like, oh, Mr. Rochester, it's all I've ever wanted. And they're engaged, and they're gonna get married. That's what happens. I'm summarizing.
I'm dying.
And then on the day of their wedding, well, I guess I should say the night before the wedding, Jane sees a ghost in Mr. Rochester's house that rips her veil in half.
Yes.
And when she wakes up that morning, the veil is still ripped in half, and she's like, oh, the ghost was real. Like, I've seen a ghost. And they go to the church to get married, and there not the priest, but the pastor or whatever says, if anyone has anything to say, speak now or forever hold your peace. And this one guy stands up and is like, no, they can't get married because Rochester is married to this guy's sister. And we get to meet Mr. Mason, who is like, yeah, he's married to my sister. He's like this little cowardly man.
And the reason this happens is Jane Eyre writes to that uncle.
Yes.
That
she's
found out about.
Yeah, and she's going to get married and blah, blah, blah.
And like the guy who came is friends with the uncle, so they came to stop the wedding, basically.
Yeah. And it gets revealed that the
stuff happening and all the stuff happening is Rochester's wife, who is locked up in his attic.
Yeah, Bertha, who went mentally ill, and he locked her up in the attic. And Grace, who we mentioned before, is the live-in nurse taking care of her.
Who gets drunk sometimes.
And then Bertha steals the key and gets out of the attic. And
it goes to show you, she is a smart woman.
Yeah. And that like, we look at mental health differently than they did back then, obviously. Even 50 years ago, if you had a crazy relative, they just got locked up somewhere.
Well, also, like, even, like, what they thought of as mental is very different from what we would think is mental now. Yeah. Like, back then, it could have, like, been, like, something just simple and then be like, she's crazy, she's spouting crazy stuff, like...
And it's also very thinly veiled that it's racism as well at the same time.
Yes.
They're saying this happened to her because she's half black.
Yes.
And that's why she went crazy.
So, I have not read it, but I know that there is a novel called Wide Sargasso Sea, and it is basically if... Her name is Antoinette, but Antoinette, Bertha, whatever you want to call it, it's from her perspective, basically, of what happened that led to... Like, it's her early life, it's her...
That's interesting. I'd like to see that. Yeah.
And then we lead up to the fire that burns everything later.
Yeah. Well, we get the details of Rochester. Rochester was the second son, and his father really didn't care for him. He liked the older son better, and so he essentially sold Rochester for £20,000. Like he sold him to someone in Jamaica or Bahamas. I can't remember which island specifically, but he was like, "Oh, sure, no, £20,000 for my son. Sure, that's fine. He'll marry your daughter. That's great." And his father knew that the girl's mother had gone insane, and there was a strong chance that she was going to go insane too. And he didn't care because he was the second son. And then Rochester's older brother dies, and so now Rochester is the heir to Thornfield Hall and everything, and comes back. And I also think a degree of being separated from her family also might have caused...
But also, and then, shoving her and, like, treating her...
Yeah, and with all the antics that Rochester does, all the manipulation he does, I can't imagine...
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I've never read it. I actually just put it on hold at the library because I'm curious to read it.
Yeah.
But I would assume that, like...
I'll have to check that out, too, because I would love to see Rochester's portrayal in that as well.
Next episode on Wide Sargasso Sea.
Yeah. But he I forgot to mention, he's also 20 years older than Jane.
Yeah.
Jane's 18 and he's 38. I'm okay with the age gap, except for the fact that Rochester does not act like a 38-year-old man, because the things that he does, I wouldn't do. I'm 35, and I wouldn't do...
He does things that a 21-year-old man would do.
Yeah, he did things that...
He's acting like...
When I was a 21-year-old douchebag, he does the things that I did. Not that I ever dressed up like a tarot card reader or anything, but
you didn't?
No, but
shocking.
I'll next lifetime, I guess. His levels of manipulation are disgusting, and he tries to justify to Jane marrying her because he was like, "Oh, in my mind, because my wife had gone crazy, I thought that I wasn't married to her anymore, and that I thought it would be okay for us to get." Which I don't fully understand, like, why he just couldn't divorce his first. Like, they say, "Oh, because she went crazy, you can't divorce her." The whole English church was founded so that Henry whatever could get divorced from his wives. That's why they left the Catholic Church and everything. Like,
it's stupid.
Yeah, I don't know.
But also, so the wedding does not happen.
No,
obviously.
Yeah.
And then Rochester's basically like, go away with me.
Yeah.
Let's just leave and be together.
I won't make you my mistress. I promise. I'll never try to sleep with you. But we'll go away together. We'll be in France or Italy or whatever. And
we'll live as husband and wife anyway.
Yeah. And Jane eventually, one day before everyone wakes up, is like, I can't do this. Like, this, no. And she just leaves. She leaves.
This is also where the quote from my back of my class ring is from, too.
Oh,
that I am no bird.
I am no bird,
in which
yeah.
I get a message from him that's just like, that's where the quote is from.
Yeah, because it's when
she's denying being a mistress.
Yeah.
I want you to know he was, like, messaging me the whole time he was reading this, and I'm just dying at him, and he's like, and this happens?
Well, because there's so much crazy stuff that happens in this that, like...
Soap opera, man.
All the twists and turns...
General Hospital before General Hospital was a thing.
Agreed. 100% agreed. But Jane leaves.
Sonny Corinthos also has a wife locked in the attic somewhere, I'm sure.
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me. But Jane leaves, and she only has I forget what English money is because their money is ridiculous, but she has 20 Canucks or whatever Harry Potter money they have. And she finds this cab driver, and she's like, I have to get away. Please take me away. And he's like, well, how much money do you have? And she's like, 20 Canucks. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly what it's going to cost for a cab ride. So he takes all the money that she has, abandons her in the middle of nowhere, and she's homeless for 3 days out in the wild.
On the moor.
Yeah, and eventually she becomes a beggar at this one house, and it's like, please take me in. And the two sisters there are like, yeah, let's take her in and take care of her, this poor girl. And it gets revealed eventually. We don't know this right now, but it gets revealed eventually, as luck would have it. They're Jane's cousins from the other side of the family. She just happened to end up at her cousins on the other side of the family's house. But before that happens, she won't tell them the details of her life, but she tells them that she was educated, and she becomes the head school teacher at the school that they're running.
Mm-hmm. There's the sisters, and they have a brother.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk about St. John.
Yes.
Have a brother.
Yeah. St. John, he's an interesting character, to say the least. But Jane's teaching at the school and doing a good job, and then eventually St. John one day comes down and he's like, I want to tell you a story about someone I know. And she's like, oh, okay, I'm not really interested in the story, but go ahead. He's like, it's about this girl who was abused by her aunt and cousins. And then she went to Lowood. Well, he's recapping Jane's life for her. And she's like, St. John. And he's like, yes, and her name was Jane Eyre. And it turns out that she's my cousin. And she's also going to get £20,000 because my
uncle left the money to her.
Which I have a note here about. I bolded it because I didn't know how much £20,000 actually was.
It's a lot of money, yeah.
It's equivalent to $2.24 million in last year's money. So it is a lot of money. And Jane's like, you know what? We're cousins.
And splits it between the four of them, basically.
All four of us are going to get it. Like, the money should have gone to you guys anyway, so we're just going to split. We're all four of us. And then St. John's like, hey, you know what else? I need you to start learning Indian. I forget what the language is exactly, but Jane's like, okay, because he's trying to learn it because he's going to go to India to be a missionary.
Yeah, she's very good at doing basically whatever he tells her because, like, she's so thankful for, like, living there and stuff.
And she's also extremely intelligent.
Yeah, and, like, it's also, like, that's her family. And, like, family that actually cares about her for once, which is not what she's had up until this point. So.
No. And this is the Rivers family. I guess I should have mentioned that their name's Rivers. But at a certain point, St. John comes to her and he's like, hey, you know what else? We should get married.
Worst proposal ever.
Yeah, he's actually in love with another woman. I forget her name now. I think I have it in here somewhere. Oh, Rosamund, or Rosalind, or whatever it was supposed. But St. John's actually in love with her, but he doesn't have the courage to say, "Hey, we should," because he feels like if he marries her, he won't actually go on the mission and everything like that. He'll love her more than God or whatever. And he's like, "No, but Jane, you're smart and
a good person.
Yeah,
and you listen to me, so like let's get married.
Yeah.
And we'll be like brother sister. Yeah. But married.
You'd be the perfect wife, and you know, it's not weird that we're cousins at all or anything because of the time period that this takes place in.
This is very anti-horny right here.
Yeah.
Not horny for you, you're not horny for me, but you know what, we'll get married and it'll be like we're living like brother and sister.
And Jane's like, hold on, time out. What's that, Mr. Rochester? Help! Like Superman or something.
Like Superman, Rochester calling in the distance.
She hears Rochester calling out to her. And so she goes back to Thornfield Hall and finds that it's burned to the ground. And she's like, oh, my precious Rochester. Oh no, he's dead. Whatever. And she goes to this bar and the bartender's like, oh yeah, it sucks what happened to him. He got into an accident with the fire and everything. His crazy wife went fully crazy and she
burned the place down and killed herself.
She started the fire in the governess's room for some reason. No one knows why. It's really weird that she would do that. Burned the place down, and Rochester woke up and saved everyone in the house, and then went to go save his crazy wife, and she fell off the roof and died. And he got hurt. He lost an eye, and lost a hand, and everything. But now he's living in this other place that his father owned. It's a much smaller place. It's not as nice, but he's living there. And Jane's like, okay, well, I'm going to go visit him there. So she gets there and she sees him standing outside trying to feel the rain because he can't see it, but he can feel the rain.
Mm-hmm.
And then she sneaks around to the back door, talks with the two servants that are there that are like, Jane, it's great that you're back. Like, oh, I wonder if... She's like, no, don't tell him I'm here. It's going to be a super secret surprise. Don't tell him. And she brings his water to him, and Rochester's dog is real excited to see her. He's like, why the hell is the dog so excited? And she's like, oh, because I'm here. And he's like, oh, Jane, my love. Oh, have you really returned to me, or is it another spirit that I've seen? Because
he heard her yelling, too.
Yeah, he's like, I've had dreams of you, but they've always disappeared. And one night I called out to you, and I heard you say, I'm coming, wait for me. But they've always... And... Bullshit. But she's like, yes, I'm here, and I'm going to take care of you. I don't care that you lost an eye and a hand. You were ugly before anyway. It's fine. And I'm an independent woman. I'm actually worth more money than you are now.
And I will remain an independent woman, but we'll get married. But
yeah. And
me, I'm independent.
And
you got that?
Yeah, since your first wife's dead, we'll get married now, and I'll take care of you all the time. Like, I'll lead you around. It doesn't matter. And they do. They get married, and they have a little baby of their own. And Jane also mentions that Adele is like a full daughter now. She makes sure that Adele's fully taken care of and everything. And I'm trying to think of what else happens. Oh, she does mention, like, her cousins, the Rivers. The two women get married and have excellent husbands.
He has a son. They give birth to a son, and he magically gains his eyesight back.
Yeah, and the one good eye that was still there. But what else happened? Oh, and St. John, he's off in India.
But he's really sick.
Yeah, and he's going to die.
Yep.
And he writes saying, I'm going to die, but it was worth it. It was... And he never mentions Jane having married Rochester. That's in there too. That, like, he's like, he never brings up Rochester. He never congratulates her on getting married. It's just, hey, I'm in India. I'm doing the Lord's work. Hey, I'm in India. I'm not feeling too well. Hey, I'm in India. I'm dying. The next letter you're going to get is from someone else saying that I'm dead. And then that's that, pretty much, I think. I'm trying to remember.
Much, like, the end kind of, like...
wraps up real quick.
Like, it's go, 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 go.
Yeah.
And reader, I married him.
Yes. But yeah, I don't know. I wrote down an overall score. Do you want... I
mean, I did not, but...
Well, I kind of recapped most of the details anyway. Let me see. Oh, yeah, I wanted to say I listened to it on Audible, and it was narrated by Theradine Newton, and she did a really fantastic job narrating it, and the runtime is only 19 hours and 10 minutes, so if you're interested in the story, if for some reason you've listened to us recap it and you haven't read it before, but you're interested, go listen to it on that. You can get it done real quickly. I do have two major criticisms. Like I said, the first 10 chapters are boring and not much really happens in them. And my second criticism is Rochester. I wrote down he's the epitome of toxic masculinity. He's manipulative, abusive, deceitful, and super horny. And if we're to trust Jane as our narrator, she didn't do a good job of painting her beloved in a good light, and I don't believe he deserves to have her. Overall, though, I highly recommend this book to anyone. You do have to struggle through the first 10 chapters, but it's highly worth it, and I gave it a 9 out of 10.
Oh, man. I just love you recapping this book. Like, it's better than a Sparky Sparks' recap of My Girl Jane.
Yeah.
It's better than the Thug Notes version. If you don't know what that is, go look up Thug Notes. I'm doing you a good favor.
Well, yeah, because he doesn't bring up how horny Jane and Rochester are for each other at all. And for me, that's the crux of the book, is that the two of them are super horny for each other the whole time.
Jane really just wanted to write her smut novel about her life.
And yeah, listen, there's a lot of elements that we did not discuss. We didn't discuss the weather and how the weather reflects, like...
Oh, we're not going to get into that.
The characters' feelings and everything like that.
Not doing that bullshit.
Yeah, there's other people out there that'll discuss those things.
Listen, we're English majors. We could probably sit here and talk about any book for, like, such a long period of time, especially something like this that has so many, like, elements and it's been around so long that there's so much about it that if you wanted any theory to apply to this, you could make it apply, probably. It was just one of those things, you know?
It was the first type of its kind and everything, and we can praise Brontë for how great she was at writing it and everything, but, we want to talk about the horniness. And we did.
And we did.
Yeah.
It's a good way to celebrate my birthday.
Yeah. Well, do you want to give it a score? Do you want to say anything else about it? Or?
I mean, I love the book. Go read it. Obviously, we're doing this for my birthday, so
yeah,
clearly I enjoy it. I would probably give it like a 9 out of 10 as well.
Yeah,
it's a good book. I think you're right. Sometimes it does slow down a bit, even later on. Like, you know, I feel like that's how literature was at the time, though.
Well, that's
I could say a lot of things about like something like Wuthering Heights too. About like I like the plot, but sometimes the like details. Oh God, man! Like you gotta get through the slogs when the slogs are there.
That's when it was originally published. It was in 3 separate volumes,
yes.
Chapters 1 through 15, which makes sense. Chapters 16 through 27, which also makes sense, and chapters 28 through 38. Like the way that it was broken up makes sense for action happening within the book, climaxes and everything. But yeah, I didn't mention that before, but that was just one of the things. I don't know.
See, I can't imagine reading that first, like reading it like that and reading the first one and being like, "Yep, totally ready to go finish this out at some point." Like,
well, I think because I've said this multiple times, the first 10 chapters are grueling to get through because they're very boring. But having 11, 12, 13, 14, it's like, ooh, what's happening now? Like, well, now I want more. We're going to actually discuss a movie very shortly that wasn't that popular of a movie, but I after watching it was like, I would like more of this, please.
Honestly, I had lots of questions at the end of said movie. Because I was very like, I don't...
Yeah. And I guess that's all we have to say about Jane Eyre.
I think so. You're going to enjoy the class.
Yes.
Dr. Davis, if you're listening, I hope you enjoyed this minor flub that I'm sure you're probably also like screaming that we're not talking about things. It's fine.
Well, at the time, right now, recording it, we're almost at the 43-minute mark. I generally end up editing out about 6 or 7 minutes from each episode because of all my ums and everything like that. So, if you want to play it in class for the students, that's fine with me too.
Oh my God, no.
No? All right.
Don't do that.
Never mind. But yes.
All right. Thank you for listening, guys.
Yeah, this has been the Once Again Podcast. Any questions, comments, or critiques can be addressed to our email at onceagainpod@gmail.com. Follow us on our social media accounts, Once Again Pod, all one word, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you'd like to contribute to the podcast, we have several tiers available on patreon.com/onceagainpod. As always, a like, follow, or share would be greatly appreciated. Thank you and have a wonderful day. And remember, we will entertain you. We will always entertain you. And just as a final note, I think we should start covering maybe some more books, because I think this is kind of a very fun thing to do.
You know what? I agree. Let me know if you think... I think it's a good pace for us, like a good takeaway from what we usually do, because I think movies...
Yeah.
I think this is much more like intellectual discussions, because it's our major. We can bring in elements that we usually don't bring in when we're talking about movies necessarily.
Maybe the podcast will evolve into being Once Upon a Time and a Book podcast.
Once again.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, but thank you, and peace out, homeboys.
Peace out, homeboys. Celebrate my birthday with me.
Yeah, happy birthday to Ashley. Woo!
I'm old.
Rumpelstiltskin always says that magic comes with a price. But for this price, you can get a nice piece of jewelry. Use code ONCEPOD for 10% off your first order at Unusual Magic Jewelry on Etsy. Click the link in the description.